session. The title of the session is History and the Imperative Present of Literary Journalism. What a fantastic session title.
You must have written it.
I must have written it. So I'm Josh Roiland, University of Maine. We have four wonderful presenters today from very different backgrounds, which is going to lead to a very rich and unique panel. We'll start, I'll introduce everybody here first, and then we'll do paper topics, or paper titles. So we have Jonathan Fitzgerald from Northeastern University. We have Kari Howard from Nieman Storyboard out of Harvard University, part of the Nieman Foundation. Kari's the editor of Storyboard. Miles Maguire, the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh, and then Ryan Marnane from Salve, Regina University in Rhode Island. So what we'll do is we'll do each paper 10 to 12 minutes. I have my card here, which I will display prominently, and then at the end we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. So we'll start with Jonathan, and are you all ready with the?
Yeah.
Okay. The title of his paper is "The Continuous Line: Visualizing the History of American Literary Journalism."
Right. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. This is my first. I don't know why I felt necessary to say, this is my first IALJS conference, and I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to frame this particular work in progress that I'm presenting here today, as well as the larger work that it's a part of, which is actually my dissertation, as a response to three particular challenges. When I began my study of literary journalism, I arrived first, as I'm sure many others did as well, at Norman Sims' seminal book, True Stories, right? We all kind of start there. In lieu of a master class on literary journalism, this to me sort of served that purpose. And I'll never forget when I read the opening words of chapter 2, in which Sims writes, tracing the history of literary journalism backward from the 20th century into the 1800s, I find that it vanishes into a maze of local publications. And on the next page, he continues, looking for literary journalism in the 19th century seems daunting. In the margin of my copy of the book, next to the opening lines of chapter 2, I wrote, this is a challenge. And it was a challenge that I intended to take up. So I had recently begun work on the Viral Text Project, which is a digital research initiative that's led by my advisor at Northeastern University. His name is Ryan Cordell, and we use machine learning techniques to comb through 19th century newspapers in search of frequently reprinted texts, or texts that in the modern parlance went viral. And so when I read about Sims' observation that the roots of literary journalism vanish into a maze of local publications, I thought, I have access to those publications, and I want to find those roots. And so this first challenge formed the basis of my dissertation project, which I'll discuss in a little bit more depth towards the end of the talk. The second challenge came in the form of an observation by another pillar of literary journalism studies, of course, Tom Connery. In the preface of A Source Book of American Literary Journalism, Connery conceptualizes the history of the genre through a series of distinct periods, which we're all probably familiar with, and then he insists, quote, the line from the 19th to the 20th century is continuous. As I began to consider the history of literary journalism, I wondered if this continuous line truly exists, and further, whether I could prove it or visualize it. And that impulse is what ignited the spark that led to the particular project that I'm presenting today. So, in part, as a way to procrastinate writing my comprehensive exam paper about the history of literary journalism, I decided to try to see if I could actually visualize the history of the genre using methods derived from the digital humanities. I call this productive procrastination. In order to make the distinct periods of literary journalism, as well as the continuous line, visible, I created a data visualization based on a comprehensive bibliography of the genre, which I compiled by mining and combining already extant bibliographies, as well as adding to the available bibliographies. And so I derived my data from 5 prominent sources that you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure. Norman Sims' bibliographies from both True Stories and Literary Journalism in the 20th Century, 2 bibliographies published in Literary Journalism Studies, and the table of contents of Kari Negoda's anthology, The Art of Fact. Sort of merge this all together. My thought here is that now, as we're still somewhat early in the development of this field of literary journalism studies, we're in the process of canon building a little bit. So I tried to pull together prominent sources that would be recognizable and respected by scholars in the field. And through a rather arduous process, which I will definitely write a blog post about, but we'll spare you the details of here, I extracted the text from the above sources. I used a series of complex regular expressions, which are really just advanced text searching queries, to extract elements such as author name, title of the work, and most crucially, date of publication from these bibliographies. And from this, I created the following visualization. Don't worry if you can't see it well, we'll get more into it later. But it shows the number of works published by year and separated by whether it's a primary or secondary source, or I think I called critical or primary here. In short, I had, in the most literal sense, created Connery's continuous line. And visualizing the long history of literary journalism was the second challenge. And again, we'll come back to this graphic and look at it a little more in detail in a bit. But it occurred to me after creating this initial visualization, and once I got on with the work of writing, first my exam papers, which I did complete, you'll be happy to know, and now my dissertation, that even more valuable perhaps than the visualization are the data from which it is composed. That is, it occurs to me that having a database of nearly 600 publications of and about literary journalism could be helpful for me personally in my scholarship, as well as I'm sure for others. And so, with that notion, and in another case of productive procrastination, I assembled this data into a searchable database accessible online there at ljbib.jonathandiegelstroh.com. I should say up front as I click over to it and see if this works. Yep, this is in the spirit of this talk, very much a work in progress. It's likely that it will break, and potentially even while I'm giving this presentation, so let's see how that goes. You're not supposed to give live demos of things, but here we are. So there are three sections to the site. The first is the bibliography, which you're looking at now. And the second tab is the timeline visualization, which I previously showed, and again, which you can look at in more detail in a minute. And in the final tab, I present some experimental work with gender in the corpus. So let's start by talking about the bibliography. It's basically an interactive database. You can click each of the column heads, and there's a part of this talk, I apologize, it feels a little bit like I'm like pitching you on some new software or something. Forgive me that. Like, this is still scholarly, believe me. So yeah, so you can click the column head of each of these here to sort of sort. So if you want to sort by last name, you can do that. You can use the search box, which is here, to search the database. And then we have these drop downs on the left, which will filter the information by source, the author's last name, and whether it's a primary or secondary source. And then we have this kind of nifty timeline slider, which will let you sort of narrow the window of time that you're interested in, which is cool. I find that combining these features is most valuable, so as a demo you might want to view, for example, all primary works of literary journalism published in the 1930s, and so we can do this, and then this is the tricky part, get it like that. And so now we're looking at, yeah, all primary works of literary journalism from the 1930s, from the 600 sources that have been, pulled together. Yeah, so there's that. Oh, did we just lose it? Why? There we go. The guy told me to keep wiggling the mouse. I guess he's really serious. Never let your hand off. All right, so the next tab here is what I call the line. And this is the visualization I presented before. It's that continuous line, very literal continuous line of literary journalism. But this time it's interactive. So again, you can filter to show only primary or secondary sources, and you can narrow it by year like we saw before. You can also actually hover your mouse over and get, in 1975, 33 secondary works. Oh yeah, but what's cool I think about this is that you can see, particularly if you filter to just primary works, we talk a lot about the different waves or the periods of literary journalism, and I feel like you can really see them. Holy smokes. Something would break. I thought it would be my own software, but no. All right. No, I think we're fine on the wire. This is going to be distracting. I'm just going to keep doing this, I think. But yeah, so if we do that, if we filter it down to primary sources, you can actually see those distinct periods or the waves of literary journalism that Kari and Sims and others talk about. So there's the peak sort of around the turn of the century. You get another one in the late 1930s into the 40s. In the 60s and 70s, of course, the new journalism, and then jump up here to the 80s, that so-called new journalism. And I should note that the latest citation in the bibliographies that I compiled was in 2011, so that's why I kind of just, don't worry, the genre hasn't ended. It didn't just, it's over. And finally, the third tab is, at present, it's the most experimental feature, but it's one that's really relevant to my larger work in progress, which again is my dissertation. In accepting Sims' challenge to trace the history of literary journalism back into the 19th century, I came across a lot of writing. This will not surprise many of you, particularly by women writers, and often in a kind of sentimental mode that was popular at the time. It strikes me as early examples of the genre that we would come to call literary journalism. But there's just a couple problems there. Most histories of the genre trace its roots back to the emergence of modernism and not to sentimentalism. We like to sort of say, like, that was something else, modernism happened, realism, there we go. And most histories and bibliographies, as this makes painfully clear, lean heavily toward male authors, right? So the blue being male there, the red. So here I offer a visualization that counts the number of publications per year, but segments them by gender. And again, you can filter the by gender or by year, or you can also, I think this is helpful, separate the graphs and see them stacked as opposed to combined. And the first thing you'll notice, of course, is that the male authors far outnumber the women authors that are listed in the extant bibliographies. For example, in 1992, it's here, this is this big spike for some reason in 1992. In 1992, there are 38 male authors to 10 women authors. You know, as you can see through the bar graph, it sort of has a pattern that goes across time there. But as a person who's interested in the 19th century roots of the genre, what's even more striking to me is that from all the sources I've pulled together, the earliest publication by women is here in 1936. I thought it would be fun if anybody wanted to guess. 1936. It's, I just, in the last second, thought I needed to do that. 3 minutes. Yikes. It's Martha Gellhorn's The Trouble I've Seen, is the first thing that shows up in here. Now, certainly, far fewer women than men were writing in the 19th century and the early 20th century. But where are the people that I'm studying right now looking at, like Margaret Fuller or Nellie Bly or Fanny Fern or Nell Nelson, just to name a few? They're not here. They're not in any of these bibliographies. So I know that there has been work in recent years to correct this imbalance, including the spring 2015 special issue of Literary Journalism Studies, which is great. But as we continue in this crucial sort of canon-building stage of the field's development, I hope more of us will turn our attention to rectifying the situation. And this is, for me, the third and sort of final challenge that motivated this work. For my part, my dissertation, which I've been previewing, but I'll tell you, is titled Setting the Record Straight, Women Literary Journalists Writing Against the Mainstream. It seeks to restore some of these women writers from the 19th century to our collective memories, and then to show how their legacy persists throughout the genre's history. And I'll certainly be adding my own bibliography to this site, which maybe will help flesh this out a little bit. And in that spirit, I want to end by asking you not only to feel free to use the site. I made it public, it's out there, you can play with it if you want to. It's in beta, as I said, so if you see anything wrong, I've got a helpful email link here. Tell me any problems that you find, whether it's technical or scholarly. I want to hear it all. But also, what I'm really hoping for is that people will be wanting to contribute their own sources as well. If you've done a lot of work on a particular author, or if you have a bibliography or a database, which would be amazing, that could be included. If you email me, I'd be happy to sort of add it in here. To summarize, this work in progress was ignited by the possibility that I might track down the roots of literary journalism from Sims' potencies of local publications. It was pushed along by the ability to visualize the breadth of the genre's history through the lens of Connery's continuous line, and it's now fueled by a desire to overcome this third challenge, the lack of women writers in our canon. And as for this particular project, again, I hope that it proves to be a useful tool if you want to try it out. Even more than that, I hope that the visualizations on offer and those that I'll be adding in the future might help us to see our field in new ways, to identify the gaps where they exist in our growing canon, and to further and better theorize this continuous line, the 200-year history of literary journalism. Thank you.
Kari's next.
Oh, actually, I'd love to have that. The one where you did the had the spikes.
Yeah.
That actually works pretty well with what.
Yeah, we'll end up with it.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
You want to see primary and secondary?
That's good.
All right.
Okay, so our next speaker is Kari Howard. Kari is the editor of the Nieman Foundation's narrative arm, Storyboard. Before that, for 20 years, she was an editor at the Los Angeles Times, part of Pulitzer Prize-winning feature story Diana Markham, correct? And so she has left that job and now lives in Maine, down the road from me, and it edits Storyboard, which is something that I think is an invaluable resource to our association and to literary journalism in general. The title of Kari's talk is A Storyboard for Journalistic Storytelling.
Yeah, it's funny. Even before I even knew the title of the session, I sort of knew I wanted to do a little time travel back to me. What a defining a moment in literary journalism history is for me, because I've always said that if I had like a journalism time machine, and I do think about such things, that I would take it to Gene Roberts' newsroom in at the Philadelphia Inquirer in the 70s and 80s, won a lot of Pulitzers, but the biggest thing about it was that he had freedom. So I worked with the Daily Times, I worked with several correspondents who had been in this newsroom, and they told me these great stories. Jeff Fleischman, David Zucchino, Barbara Denick, and it really was this thing about this freedom that he gave his writers, because it always seemed like my spiritual home. So recently I asked Jeff what he remembered about working there, and he said, "I never was in a newsroom before or since that was so dedicated to storytelling, to stripping it all down to the human. It was a place to take chances, to swing big, to succeed, and sometimes to fail, but to look at what we did through the lens of a novel, to bring it to life. You felt part of something important." And he said that when Roberts left the paper in 1990, they had a party and they handed out these cards for these awards that was called the Eugene L. Roberts Prize. And it read, "The Eugene L. Roberts Prize is dedicated to the story of the untold event that oozes instead of breaks, to the story that reveals, not repeats, to the reporter who zigs instead of zags, to the truth as opposed to the facts, to the forest, not just the trees, to efforts at portraying real life itself, to journalism that wakes me up and makes me see, to the revival of the disappearing storyteller." And I would say that in traditional newsrooms, at least, newspaper newsrooms, it does seem like the storyteller is disappearing. When I went to the LA Times in 1992, we had 1,000 people in the newsroom. And then when I left a year and a half ago, 100 of us left all at once, there were about 300. So just to show what's that happening. And so you have shrunken newsrooms, I mean, drastically shrunken. You have new demands of digital and fast clicks and everything. So you can pretty much figure out that literary journalism in a traditional newsroom is not, is disappearing in some of them. But the LAT had this tradition of beautiful storytelling, taking chances with writing. My last job at the paper was as the editor of Column 1, and it had been this page one presence of narrative literary journalism since the 60s. Called Column 1 because it was in, everyone here probably knows what Column 1. We had to change it to the paper. We had to make it great reads online because no one knew what Column 1 meant. But it was like this oasis on the page, giving people a break from the news. And at the paper, we had another name for the Column 1. We called it non-dupe. And that came from non-duplicated original content. And really, they had some just great writers with great voice. It was Bella Stumbo. I would recommend reading these. Bella Stumbo, Rick Meyer, even when Jeff Fleischman, who I worked with, one of my favorites. We did some pretty daring stuff. We did a story about an aging Russian actress told in the second person. One of my favorites is a story about this woman who lived on a roof in Cairo, very interior. And there's actually a book called, what's it called? How Far Can a Piano Fly? Is the name of a collection of some of the Column ones. So when I finally worked out the nerve to take this buyout, I went in and the editor told me, "We're not going to let you take the buyout." And I was like, "What? 100 people are leaving? I am not, more valuable to those 100." And it obviously wasn't that. It was, I think, I figured it out once he relented, is that he knew I was the keeper of the flame of Column 1, and that if I left, then that torch might go out. But I don't want to be totally bummer. Some things do give me hope about the future of it. For one thing, the next generation. I can't tell you how many 20-somethings came and told me that they wanted to work at the LA Times just to write a Column 1. And there's some very talented. There's talent. There's the desire is there, and I have to believe that newspapers will realize that clicks are not the way to the future. That loyalty is the way, and I think literary journalism readers are probably the most loyal out there. And even then, I mean, until then, people do find ways to tell beautiful stories. Diana Markham, that was a great moment working with her. She won the Pulitzer for feature writing 2 years ago, I think. We sort of did this as a stealth project where we didn't really tell the bosses that it was, because once you do that, it's a capital S series, and then you have a lot of involvement with bosses. And we wanted to tell it the way we wanted to tell it. Was go small. Everyone else was doing the Drought. It's about the Drought. Big, sort of small. How it affected people. No nutgrass, no sweep. Just doing it that way. And it really was one of the most special moments in my career, not just because Diana has a gift for empathy and writing, is that the bosses trusted us to do what we were doing, and they gave us that freedom. And for a moment, I felt like I was in, sort of Gene Roberts' newsroom. So now it's Storyboard. I do feel the same sense of freedom that I had there, but it is new to me because I am sort of in between. To talk about this, in between these two worlds. I am, not quite in the newsroom. I'm not in academia, but I'm learning my way. But since I started, it's been a year. I've seen a lot more that's given me hope, and I think there's this new wave of different types of storytelling that I'm really intent on spotlighting. And I thought I would give a few examples of some we've covered in my first year there. Let's see. For one thing, there's a new crop of digital-only outlets that, Huffington Post, Highline. I love Epic Magazine. It's, I'm not sure where it's California. And it did one of my favorite stories of recent years about these rival ice cream trucks. A little war. It's called the Cold War. And it was so well done. And one reason I loved it so much is that two writers, they were funny. I mean, there was heart, there was something, this emotional heft, but they were funny. And has that been done? A story about the lack of humor, to me, in general, kind of in long form? I think that's pretty striking. Because that's if you can carry that off, if you can have emotion plus some humor, I think that's gold. Let's see. There's like the new print and online magazines, California Sunday, which really had an admirable commitment to literary journalism. Older ones like Outside Magazine, to me it's been on a great role right now with it. There are regional magazines I like, down east in Maine. I'll speak up for Maine. Brian Kevin, he's the managing editor, and he did this piece about this drug gang in Belfast, Maine in the 80s. And it's cinematic and just really well done. I recommend that. It's called the Belfast Operation. And then we did this thing on this Norwegian newspaper that committed to 9-part serial spread over like 2 months, I think. And they gave they were kind of good, yeah. And then of course this new world of serials with podcasts and everything. That's a rebirth. Instagram, people might not think of, but I think you can do some great storytelling on it, both image and word-wise. We did one on Oral Roberts' gay grandson, Randy Potts, that he combined sort of poetry with his memoir of and images, both disturbing and dreamy. It was very effective. There was a New York Times Facebook Live whodunit they did about this pile of Kodachrome slides that had been left on the street in New York, and it was sort of this mystery of unraveling through crowdsourcing and this reporter of who was the woman, who was the life in these photos, and who dumped them on the street. And so people were sort of in there and invested because they were helping and they wanted to know how the outcome in it. So it sort of crafted a nice narrative arc. So I have to say that I guess even though I would love to take that time machine back to Gene Roberts, I'd also like to take it forward like 20 years. And I think we're going to have some great different types of storytelling then.
Next, we have Miles Maguire from the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh. The title of Miles' paper is Going for the Gold, How Literary Journalism Techniques Have Come to Dominate the Pulitzer Prizes. Miles.
As I think we all know, that at various times in its history, literary journalism has been viewed as a subversive mode of expression, a bastard form, and a threat to traditional journalism and its values. But by at least one important measure, literary journalism in the early decades of the 21st century has become firmly ensconced within the mainstream. A review of award-winning works in the Pulitzer Prize competition shows that the techniques of literary journalism can now be found in a wide range of categories. Not surprisingly, the feature category has been dominated by literary journalism since it was established in 1979, with the award going that year to John Franklin, a pioneer in the field of creative nonfiction. In the words of the Pulitzer Board, the new prize was to recognize, quote, a distinguished example of feature writing giving prime consideration to high literary quality and originality. So we can see that as early as the 1970s, the Pulitzer judges were willing to regard high literary quality, to reward high literary quality, but they had to create a special category to do it in. Today, somewhat more surprisingly, the techniques of literary journalism are freely applied in categories such as investigative journalism and explanatory journalism. In recent years, literary journalism has also found its way into the Pulitzer's most prestigious category, public service, where each year a gold medal is awarded. I'm going to base my analysis on the four essential techniques identified by Tom Wolfe as the elements of new journalism: scene-by-scene reconstruction, dialogue in full, third-person point of view, and status details. One of the interesting things we will see is that some of these techniques are much more frequently found than others, which suggests to me that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists have different degrees of comfort with the individual techniques, which in turn raises some interesting questions about why. Is it because some of them are more reliable, more ethical, or is it that some of them are harder to pull off because they require a greater amount of skill or reporting time? Let me start by giving you an example. I will read it to you. So this is the lead from the 2017 gold medal winner. It goes like this. The morning of May 4th, 2011, Jamila El-Shabazz watched out the window of her Bronx apartment as a team of police officers fanned across the rooftop of Banana Kelly High School. The 43-year-old mother of five said she didn't think much of the scene. Drug raids were common in her neighborhood. As she did most mornings, El-Shabazz said she went to her bedroom to feed her newborn son and to worship before a shrine of candles and carvings arranged atop her wardrobe. Her most treasured object was a wooden tray her father had brought her from Nigeria. A deity of the Ifo religion, which she practices as a high priestess, was carved on its surface and covered in a residue of finely crushed eggshells. El-Shabazz used the substance, known in her faith as Ofun powder, to cleanse the shrine. She took fresh clumps of the powder from a cap and began to break it up in her hands. That's when the narcotics officers kicked in the door. What we can see what's missing right away, dialogue in full. As Wolfe pointed out, getting to a place where a journalist can incorporate dialogue as opposed to mere quotes requires extraordinary feats of reporting, whereby reporters invest the time to actually witness the scenes in other people's lives as they took place. Now that all Pulitzer Prize categories have been open to magazine stories, we may see more dialogue in the future. But this is the one journalism technique that appears least frequently in Pulitzer winners outside the feature category, although it can be found. For example, the 2014 prize in explanatory journalism was won by the estimable Eli Saslow for articles about the widespread use of food stamps during the recession, and the technique can be found in his work. But if we go back to our 2017 gold medal winner, we clearly see that the reporter is using scene-by-scene reconstruction to advance the narrative. First the view from the apartment window, then the retreat to the bedroom, and then the switch to what's happening at the front door. What we do see in the bedroom, what do we see in the bedroom but status details, the recording of everyday acts and items that help to construct identity. Feeding her newborn, worshiping before a shrine made up of candles and carvings, and then the ritual cleansing using finely crushed eggshells. We are also looking at all of this through the eyes of IALJS, in other words, with the third person point of view, the fourth technique that we'll identify. My sense here is that the reporter or her editors were a little wary of just asserting that they had entered the mother's mind and were capable of portraying that point of view. So we see that some of the descriptions are specifically attributed to IALJS, traceable to some documentary evidence. But the attributions are subtly inserted in the interiors of sentences in ways that suggest to me that the journalists were hoping to pull off the magic trick of, to quote Woolf, experiencing the emotional reality of the scene, as experienced by the main character, while still maintaining a degree of distance and accountability. I'm not arguing here that literary journalism has been fully absorbed into the mainstream. Few Pulitzer Prize-winning articles, and probably none outside of the feature category, carry all of the marks of a new journalism, or do not at some point rely on passages of direct expository prose to provide background and clarification. In the era of fake news, pure literary journalism, with the questions that it raises about transparency, overt subjectivity, and advocacy, will continue to give pause to judges in prize competitions like the Pulitzer. But I think it's time to recognize that the adroit use of literary journalism techniques, especially things like scene-by-scene narrative, status details, and third-person point of view, have almost become the price of admission for producing a prize-winning work. If you look back over the public service winners,
This is soundtrack.
not that I know.
I don't know what's going on. Dirt.
Star Wars presentation.
That's cool.
The aliens.
Did I was for shame to see this? Oh, it is on. It's gonna be.
Three at the same time?
Yeah, three, I guess.
Okay. And the other seven.
Yeah.
I'll help it from the
But right now, nobody's watching.
Is the best part?
What's that?
Is the best part?
I don't know.
Maybe it's different for you too.
Yeah. But I'm not so sure if it's loud enough, so if the microphone is good enough, so everybody gets to hear.
Oh, great. I think a breaker was tripped. This happens occasionally.
I can speak on
Okay, I'm gonna make a phone call.
So we'll continue with Miles's without the.
without the slides. It's not much enough. So what I'm saying is that these techniques of new journalism are pretty much everywhere. If you look back over the public service winners, the gold medal winners, so this is sort of the top of the pyramid in the Pulitzer competition, you'll see these techniques are deployed on articles dealing with topics that range from the Asian seafood industry to domestic abuse in South Carolina. And I just quickly try to close with some suppositions about what the transformation of an outsider methodology into a standard tool of reporting may mean for practitioners, educators, and news audiences. For practitioners working for traditional outlets and working traditional beats, it seems to me that acquiring the skills of new journalists will be critical if they want to take their work to the highest levels of recognition. Here's a quote from Eli Saslow. "Farming for characters. I feel like it could be such an underrated part of reporting. The reporting to get to the right story before the reporting for the actual story really begins." There aren't many newsrooms that I know of where reporters have adopted this kind of approach, but maybe they need to learn how to do that. Immersion reporting is always going to be tough on a daily news cycle, but reporters who are on the lookout for the right story, while they're also working the story right in front of them, will go farther and faster. On the flip side, literary journalists who may think they are making a statement by working in the form may have to realize that what they are doing is not nearly so revolutionary as it may have felt 40 years ago. There is not as much message in the medium as there used to be. The question is, what's next? For educators, I think there is a real challenge to how we deal with teaching narrative technique. I don't think this can continue to be walled off, as I think it is in most places, and left for advanced or special topics courses. Narrative reporting, as I've tried to show, is mainstream reporting, and the sooner that students learn of that, the better off they will be. Finally, for news audiences, the use of new narrative techniques may help them feel that a particular report is either more or less credible. Anecdotes can be very compelling, but they don't always exemplify what reporters want them to. The narrative approach can become the excuse to reject the premise and findings of a particular report. It seems to me that one of the most important things that can be done for news audiences is to make sure that the strengths and weaknesses of narrative be incorporated into efforts to improve news literacy generally. And perhaps one way that practitioners can help this along is to apply new journalism techniques, once largely reserved to exploring marginal situations, to the circumstances and especially the challenges of the mainstream audience, to help the mainstream rediscover its connections to those on the margin. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. Sorry again about the audio issues. Our last presenter, Ryan Marnane from Salve, Regina University in Rhode Island. Title of Ryan's talk today, is this part of your dissertation?
No, not at all.
Sorry. The title is Feeling the Facts, Literary Journalism Amid the Anthropocene.
So I have slides that
Do you want to try again?
No, don't.
Well,
I'll just visualize.
the sound was on even without the slide.
So I've had difficulties kind of putting the severity of climate change into a context that my students can grasp and digest, let alone my own metabolizing. So I turned to literary journalism. I think it's uniquely suited for discussions regarding the Anthropocene. So this paper is principally concerned with pedagogy, what's effective in the classroom. On July 29th, 2014, at 11:43 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Dr. Jason Box, climatologist and professor in glaciology at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, tweeted, image of tweet, even if a small fraction of Arctic seafloor carbon is released to the atmosphere, we're fucked. The tweet immediately went viral, inspiring a series of cautionary headlines in its wake, flash cautionary headlines. Motherboard, IFL Science, and Salon, to name a few. Following the media flare-up, in response to Dr. Box committing the sin of climatological candor, John Richardson, longtime columnist for Esquire magazine, was prompted to reach out to Dr. Box to discuss his, quote, recent gloomy statements. That discussion, and subsequent traveling to the ice sheets themselves to meet with Box and his family, would later become the makeup of Richardson's August 2015 publication, The Ballad of the Sad Climatologist, When the End of Human Civilization is Your Day Job. It's a vivid, harrowing piece of literary journalism, addressing how climate scientists deal with the stark, depressing realities of the changing planet they're studying. There's a name for this new, gloomy world of ours, and it's called the Anthropocene. the proposed stratospheric name for a new slice of geological time we're currently enmeshed in. It's an epoch made distinct by significant, measurable human impact on the Earth and its climate, quote, characterized by the advent of the human species as a geological force. The threat of global warming and climate change remains the defining cautionary ethos of our generation. While longitudinal repercussions remain uncertain, its current reality is verified beyond question. The facts are evident, but are we feeling them? Quote, rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. They will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions across the globe, end quote. This cautionary declaration does not come from Richardson's article, but Pentagon's 2014 Climate Change Adaptation Roadmap. NASA reports that just this month we reached 406.17 parts per million of carbon dioxide, the highest it's been in over 650,000 years, and there's images of all these data points, and the point is to overflow you with information and abstract science that maybe it's hard for you to parse through. So it's a bit performative of what I'm doing here. Part of my overarching argument. Global temperature has risen 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880, with 9 of the 10 warmest years on record occurring in the last 16 years. This is all data gathered from NASA. Data show that 2016 is now officially the warmest year on record globally, making it 3 consecutive years of record-breaking global temperatures, with 2017 on track to surpass 2016 numbers. Researchers at the University of Hawaii have argued that we'll be dealing with, quote, historically unprecedented climates as soon as 2047, with some worst-case estimates suggesting that we might see 7 to 8 feet of sea level rise as soon as 2040. More images. Exhausted? Me too. And that's not the worst of it. Nor is it close to the overwhelming number of reports from scientists, diplomats, and philosophers addressing our current ecological and, by extension, humanitarian crisis. You know this. You've seen these images before. In Kevin Zambrano's review of Barrett Baumgart's China Lake, A Journey into the Contradicted Heart of a Global Climate Catastrophe, winner of the 2016 Iowa Prize for Literary Nonfiction, writes, quote, in 2017, calling climate change a catastrophe just proves you've read the news, end quote. And my argument is exactly. The facts are evident. A Twitter count will suffice. But my job as an instructor is to not flood students with facts like I did to you, but to provide them with a framework in which those facts can be felt. And to most effectively do this, I turn to literary journalism, and in particular, the aforementioned piece by John Richardson. So my paper today, Feeling the Facts, Literary Journalism Amid the Anthropocene, is principally concerned with literary journalism's approach to reporting the effects of climate change and its function in classroom settings. I'd like to better historicize the paper and the genre's approach to climate change, hence work in progress. What I'm offering today is a reading and reflection of Richardson's article, an article that has become immensely helpful in the classroom setting, a classroom often made up of students who A, don't really care about climate change, and B, come from a wide variety of backgrounds wherein science comprehension is often lacking. Feeling the Facts comes, my title comes from Thomas Connery's A Third Way to Tell the Story, included in Norman Sims' 2008 collection, Literary Journalism in the 20th Century, which I'm quickly learning everyone knows about. It's brilliant. Connery writes, literary journalism does not simply present facts, but the feel of facts, or, as one critic has said of Stephen Crane's newspaper pieces, a rendering of felt detail, end quote. That is to say that the third way to tell the story, that of the literary journalist, writes Connery, is reconciling fact and fiction, reality and language, by being a mode of expression more imaginative than conventional journalism, but less imaginative than fiction. So we return back to Richardson's article to explore the synthesis of indicative reportage, facts, and subjunctive imaginative prose, how those facts might feel, an imperative reconciliation. The Ballad of the Sad Climatologist is certainly not the first instance of literary journalism addressing anthropogenic impact. Open any edition of the Best American Nature and Science writing from 2000 onwards, and you'll encounter a number of pieces within the tradition. Even Longform's environment tags provide us with a wellspring of articles that fall within the genre, highlighting articles from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring to Rebecca Solnit's Letters from a Down Canyon, published just last month in California Sunday Magazine. Yet while literary journalistic engagements with climate change continue to expand in both scope and frequency, I have found limited secondary resources addressing the surge in the genre's evolution. Maxwell T. Boykoff's 2009 article, Media Representational Practices in the Anthropocene, an exceptional account of how mass media changed the public discussion surrounding global warming, tracing news articles addressing human-caused climate change from as early as 1930s to today. Boykoff's scholarship has been immensely helpful for my own thinking, but it fails to address the role of literary journalism in particular. Why is this? A 2008 essay by Christine Russell, published with Columbia Journalism Review, provides some insight. Russell's essay is a call to arms, arguing that we're in need of more journalistic engagements with climate change science. Yet she ends in doubt that traditional journalism itself is not up to the task. Journalists will play a key role, this is from Russell, quote, journalists will play a key role in shaping the information that opinion leaders and the public use to judge the urgency of climate change. What needs to be done about it? When and at what costs? It is a vast, multifaceted story whose complexity does not fit well with the journalism's tendency to shy away from issues with high levels of uncertainty and timeframes of decades rather than days or months. The shying away from issues with high levels of uncertainty is another reason why I find literary journalism uniquely suited for such engagements. Because the literary journalist, writes Norman Sims, quote, recognize a need for a consciousness on the page through which the objects in view are filtered. The presence of the narrator in the story that gives us something to travel with. Someone whose thoughts we can hear. Someone to act as a guide in a strange world, end quote. What makes Richardson's piece so damn novel is his inversion of objects in view. Thank you. Instead of reporting what the scientists are publishing, which is what we think of when we think of traditional environmental journalism, Richardson reorients the focus towards the scientists themselves dealing with these unprecedented findings. Reporting not the science per se, but how the science affects the consciousness of those doing the field work. Richardson might be our guide in this strange, uncertain world, but is the consciousness of the scientists themselves functioning as our main attraction. Opening his article with Box's tweet and their subsequent email exchange, Richardson frames the immersion he's about to embark on, and, by extension, that of his readers. Quote, I wanted to meet with Box to find out how this outspoken American is holding up. He has left his country and moved his family to witness the studying and the melting of Greenland up close. How does being the one to look at the grim facts of climate change most intimately, day in and day out, affect a person? Is Box representative of all the scientists most directly involved in the defining issue of the new century? How are they being affected by the burden of their chosen work in the face of changes to the Earth that could render it a different planet? End quote. In short, gloom is setting in, and it's contagious. The narrative unfolds with a complicated plot structure, beginning and ending with Richardson's communication with Box, interspersed with sobering profiles of acclaimed and vilified climatologists such as Michael Mann. There's been images, but there's another image of Michael Mann's famous hockey stick graph. Gavin Schmidt and Camille Parmesan of the University of Texas, who is a member of the group that shared a Nobel Prize with Al Gore for their climate work, who announced that she'd become, quote, professionally depressed and was leaving the United States for England. For more than 30 years, Richardson writes, climate scientists have been living a surreal existence. Quote, the rise of melancholy mood that scientists, politicians, activists, and academics are experiencing around their climate research is something you're not likely to encounter with traditional journalism, because these are feelings. Facts aren't enough. Again, we need to feel them. We do so with story, we do so with narrative. Deborah Blum, guest editor of the Best American Science and Nature Writing 2014, frames the importance of bridging the gap between science and storytelling. Quote, It is the stories that we tell, the ones that really do justice to the scientific process. We show our readers that arc, that curving, complicated lines that link discovery and development, choice and consequence. It sounds like such a simple thing, but it's when we connect the dots that we can connect with our readers in a richer sense. We remind them of the role that research and its results play in their own lives. And we remind them that the scientific exploration of the world around us can reveal a portrait of connected lives on a tiny and far too fragile planet. The bridge between not merely translating the data from science into a language for the layperson to digest, but rather rendering of what these facts might mean and how they might feel on the nerve endings of those not only doing the research, not only reporting thereof, but also the ones experiencing the narratives for themselves. This is my case for literary journalism, or the Anthropocene. And I'll end with a little hot take here, a wax poetic. If neuroscience has become the new epistemology, like some have argued, then climatologists themselves have become the new existentialists. Yet instead of retreating to the Black Forest, some of the most outspoken activists and researchers are migrating north to Greenland and the Arctic, perennially coming back to town square as modern madmen image, tweeting, "Civilization is dead and you have killed it." Or in a more colloquial, subjunctive term, we're fucked. Yet the question here is not who will wash the oil off our hands, but rather how are we telling the story and teaching of the mess that we're making.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so we have about 30 minutes for question and answer, and we have distinguished Tom Connery, who got cited in both Jonathan's and Ryan's.
I came in a little bit late just as the source book was up on there, and I didn't hear how you were using it. I'm kind of curious, source book of literary journalism.
Oh, yeah. That was easy. So what I actually did, my project was grabbing the bibliographies from your book and, wait, did I get the one from source book? Yeah. And others, and sort of compiling bibliographies anyways, the main bibliographies of literary journalism into an online database that people could search.
So then the follow-up question is, a later book called Journalism and Literature, did you look at that at all with that more updated bibliographies that I wrote?
I don't have that. I mean, that's excellent. That's part of the reason why I wanted to present this today.
Yeah, I think particularly when it comes to women journalists and writers of the 1800s, that's very much, moving forward from that earlier book.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions? Yes.
Ryan, I can answer the student's question. Here I am, student. But my story doesn't have a character. There's no climate scientist in my trends piece or something.
I'm sorry, say that
Okay.
again.
How do you handle the students' questions who can't find a story arc, can't find a character around which to wind a climate story? Like you're suggesting that you have to tell the stories through climatologists or other people, real people.
Well, I don't teach writing.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I led that on.
Okay, you teach environmental science?
No, I teach Introduction to Literary Studies to a bunch of business majors.
We're so glad to have you here. That's great.
Well, I'm happy to be here. And again, I mean, I'm here looking for suggestions on how to make this a more effective contribution to this community that I'm happy to be a
I
part
think
of.
it's great that you're using these examples in that class. Yeah.
But I mean, what I'm finding interesting, and I'd ask you for your suggestions,
Throw it back.
it doesn't seem like people are talking about this academically. Like, what is the role of literary journalism amid this warming world of ours? I can't seem to find any secondary resources that are exploring this question. So if anything, I hope that this paper can function as a spark for discussion and future research.
Well, we should talk about the Society of Environmental Journalists looks into some of these things, as well as like the typical narrative themes in environmental journalism, and that might be some place you find resources.
I would argue that Diana's series about climate change is finding a way to make things personal, make things felt.
Okay.
I've got another question for Ryan, kind of following up on the last question. You do a really great job showing how journalists use narrative and characters to try and hook the readers. And I'm wondering, just from your readings, have you observed literary journalists or other journalists taking a stab at the explanatory aspect themselves? And if so, what kinds of literary techniques are they using? Yes, that's my question.
No, I haven't. Richardson's article for me does something similar to what Catherine Schultz's article, the really big one, which was a Pulitzer winner, which is focusing on, I can't remember the individual's name who her piece is centered around, but he's the professor of seismology in the Pacific Northwest. But certainly focusing on the development of the character of the scientists who are doing the work, rather than translating the data for the individuals reading the pieces. That to me has been unique and kind of important for my own engagements and also for students. Flooding them with data doesn't do anything, but when it penetrates character, that seems to be most effective.
Well, now that you mention it, she also she has this great tactile metaphor.
Oh, it's brilliant, right?
So maybe that's part of it. It's trying to come up with different ways to describe it and explain the unexplainable, or the what's difficult to understand if you're actually not a scientist.
Right. I mean, it's kind of a really difficult thing to talk about in general. Like, we're all a part of it, we're in it, and we still don't have a language to make sense of something that's so large. You know, Timothy Morton calls it a hyperobject. We need new words to talk about this thing that we're a part of. We still don't have the language. But certainly that piece by Schultz, and I think Richardson's article is exceptional for doing that. At least if not providing new language, going directly to the individuals who are mining the data and realizing that they don't know what to do either.
Sorry, can I ask, the Catherine Schultz piece, I don't know that one. Can you just let us know what that is, where it's from?
It's called The Really Big One. It was published in the New Yorker, and it was the Pulitzer winner for the feature in 2015.
Thank you.
Comment for Ryan, I guess. There's a lot of movies that showcase the disasters of not paying attention to scientists, and usually it's like it's an inevitable conclusion. So it seems that anything that would also showcase somebody that's more proactive in trying to rectify might stimulate a little more discussion. A couple of things come to mind. One is, this is not climate change per se, but scientists, the Flint water crisis in Michigan was really prompted by a scientist from Virginia Tech who had done water studies and determined that the lead content was pretty high. And so that was a really positive depiction of a scientist in that story. And then I suppose another might be some comparison between the flood control in Amsterdam versus the flood control in New Orleans, and that, you know, that there are positive aspects that can work. So I'm not sure, I couldn't name any films that show climate science at work, but it would be a way to overcome some of the negative narrative, and I think that's, you know, to try to take the peaks off of that mountain would be useful.
Now I'm thinking of Josh's paper that even the omissions are what we should be exploring, right? It's political what's not included. But Richardson's piece is clearly one-sided, right? I mean, he's not interviewing climate scientists who are optimistic. He's focusing on the very harrowing and negative, the small minority who are vocal about it. Because in the scientific community, you can't show feelings, right? We want the data, not how the data is making you feel.
Who Killed the Electric Car would be an example like that of an omission that was covered that shows. And I think that's available. I know it's available. Netflix or something.
Okay. Other questions? Anybody? Jack?
I want to thank Jonathan for his work on the database, getting that together. Very, very interesting. It's going to be incredibly helpful. As somebody that studies the more modern multimedia enhanced literary journalism that's out there, I just wondered if you have thoughts on how you can put some of that more recent work in there. I mean, it's not in the old literature, and it's certainly, you know, just being talked about now, but
Yeah.
how you can get that in there.
Yeah,
So when I started building this, I felt like really good about like, well, look what we can do, and I can compile, and this is going to be really helpful. I mean, I felt that sort of selfishly first, and then for other people. But I also felt like I was starting to go down a rabbit hole, and like, where would it end? And so I think, I mean, well, and, you know, everything that people are mentioning, and you know, like, I haven't read that article. That should that be in here? But so my idea was really just first to sort of get eyes on the canon that we have, like what we're working with. But I mean, the reason why I have an email link on there, and I sort of ended that way, was I really would like to. I don't want to make it my full-time job or anything, but I really would like to build it out and to like make it a sort of living database that we can sort of add to. And so with that in mind, I have been thinking about ways to, and I'm sort of building something that I wasn't ready to show, to be able to submit, you know, like to be able to just sort of like, you have an idea of something that should be in there, and just like a form where you can just put it in, you know, and just, I don't know, make it like Wikipedia in that way, where it can all sort of like add to it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to make a comprehensive thing, but yeah, I'd love to keep it alive.
There's just a lot of really great work out there that I just don't feel like people are seeing, because there's just so much. And unless you follow, well, like longform.org, you know, I get there every week. Tell me what they like, you know?
Right, I can just port their artists.
You know, it's just, it's hard. I just feel like there's so much great stuff out there. And I think, you know, Miles, you're right in saying that narrative journalism is mainstream journalism now. It's just, there's so much good stuff. It's just really hard to keep up with it.
No, I totally agree.
I think you should apply to be a visiting Nieman fellow and build this out and have Nieman pay for it.
Do you know anybody?
I'm serious though. I think that this is the kind of projects that they fund are projects like this. I have a question for Miles. So Miles, in this piece you're talking about Pulitzer Prize winners. How does it compare, or have you thought about looking at, or have you looked at Pulitzer Prize winners as compared to National Magazine Award winners?
I haven't thought about it because I was mostly interested in, you know, this idea that the Pulitzers are newspapers and traditional, and you know, so I would assume the National Magazine Award winners are very literary and have been.
Questions? Yeah.
Miles, did you see in your study at all any examples of humor as a technique that Kari mentioned would be nice to see?
Yeah. That's a good question. Dark humor, black humor.
That's good too.
Yeah, but not a lot.
Not in the feature winners. So I don't.
It's probably like comedies never winning Best Picture.
Right. Fish called Wanda, and it didn't get that win. Or maybe he won for Best Actor.
But Annie Hall, that was 40 years.
I didn't expect it. I was just wondering.
Other questions at all? Yeah.
For Jonathan, it also seems like you're sort of on the verge of a methodology. This happens to be focused on new journalism history, or literary journalism history, but if you can explicate the approach you use to search the databases, design the website, that's the sort of thing that's transferable now with the digital databases of magazines and other articles, especially the ones that are local to one university. That's the kind of thing that seems like it makes even more sense at Nieman, where you establish, here's a playbook for how to do this, which with a pretty impressive website as well. So.
And I just have to show up at all those places that have these firewalls or these paywalls and smile and hope that they get it. That's the trick. I mean, that's, I think, why so many people who do digital work do work on the 19th century, because we can access that stuff. So it's more likely for me that I will start there. I mean, that's sort of the beginning, the first two chapters of my dissertation sort of live in the 19th and early 20th century. And yeah, I sort of have started to imagine ways in which this becomes more than just citations and actually like, ability to sort of get into some text and stuff.
It's really impressive.
Thank you.
Questions? I have a question for Kari. What do you see, so you're at your first IALJS conference. You've been at Storyboard for a year. How do you see those two entities? What possible connections can you see building between those two entities?
Yeah, that's definitely something I'm trying to do more of. Yeah, like-minded things. Doing these, want to do like long reads. But yeah, this. I mean, because you see, I probably saw. I've been taking notes during a lot of these. That a lot of the, definitely. I think we could have people, if they're game, contribute some, because you've studied all these things. And Ryan right here has done a piece, I'm going to do another one. I recommend the one he did it right before the election, and it was the Hunter Thompson.
John McCain.
John, you published one with.
I did Hunter Thompson, he did John McCain. But David Foster Wallace.
David Foster Wallace, yeah.
Yep.
Yes, David Foster Wallace and John McCain. So, I mean, I think that would be sort of a cool thing. Obviously, on this, I'm going to post things from this. Anyone else want to have any ideas? I'd love to hear them.
I just think it's a great place for public scholarship to be able to sort of do some of the things that we do in our academic careers, our academic writing, and bring it to a more an audience that you have I think a wider sort of scope and view that can see the stuff. And so I think it's a wonderful thing for academics to say, oh, I'm really interested in this topic or that topic, and it fits in with Storyboard's mission, and I'm going to write about it.
Yeah.
Kari, can you tell us a little bit more about who uses Storyboard? Is it primarily writers of this kind of text? Is it,
I don't know, because but I know from reactions I get from people. I mean, it definitely is. Well, writers are the biggest thing. But I get letters. Pardon?
Scholars too? Do you have?
I don't get letters from scholars. But, you guys not email or?
How about? Can you raise your hand if you've ever been on the Storyboard website?
I actually had something published like in 2010.
Yeah.
Years ago.
Yeah.
That was probably like the beginning of. That's when Paige was it Paige?
It was Paige.
Yeah. So I think that's around.
Andrea. Yeah.
Oh yes, Andrea.
Because Storyboard used to identify certain pieces that they called notable narratives.
We still do that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's still okay because I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, because you do. In fact, we have. I think there's one coming up next week. I don't remember which one it is. Where so we have. If you haven't looked at this, you are exploring the craft of literary journalism, and so there's different categories. There is what's simplest is it used to be called 5 questions, and I have made it 5-ish because I don't like the limits. There is, then the most hardest one is annotations, where you do interview the reporter, you have a Q&A, but then you are, annotating throughout the story, asking why they made choices, and reporting and writing choices. Those are fun, but those are a lot of work. I have fun doing them. There are. And
I think that the Annotation Tuesday one, can be some of the most useful things for scholars. Elon Green interviews Gay Talese on Frank Sinatra Has a Cold, and you read it, and Elon's asking him all these, why did you do this? Why did you do that? And I think for scholars, it's like, we don't have Gay Talese sitting here. We can't ask him why he did those things, but Elon did that. He did it for Tom Wolfe. What was it the Leonard Bernstein piece, or Radical Chic, I think he did. He's done it for John Jeremiah Sullivan. He's done it for lots of writers. It's just a really useful resource.
The Gay Talese one is epic.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I recommend it.
Who is that again? Elon?
His name is Elon Green, ELON GREEN.
Great Twitter account.
Yeah, he's on Twitter, but just be warned that he's a unique Twitter presence.
There was another good one we just did recently on Ron Rosenbaum's The Secrets of the Blue Box, and that's a pretty epic one too. I recommend it. And I can't believe it hadn't been done, because it's a fairly significant thing. But we also do so there's some notable narratives. One called Story. Why is this so good? There's some of it's kind of wonky. I can't just if it's like, why is this so good? Notable narrative and storycraft. There's some squishiness. And then something I just launched is, which maybe everyone in this room can contribute. That would be great. Is one great sentence. Because everyone has sentences they love, and so social media is easy, and it's just a sentence and a graph, say, explaining why you love it, why you think it's great. So I would welcome one from everyone. Because then you'll hear me talking about the sentences all the time.
From Miles, if I heard this correctly, you started to see a shift in the coverage of the awards granted in Pulitzers. When was that?
Well, the feature category was introduced in 1979, and then I haven't tracked every year, to be honest with you, but you can sort of see it growing from there. And if you look over the last 10 years, it's the techniques are there in lots of different categories. It's not just features anymore. It's when Eli Saslow was writing about food stamps, and his task was, he says he was looking through a copy of the federal budget, and it's this deep, and he wanted to write a story about something, and he saw food stamp use had soared in the recession, and then he started going out, and the whole series is really, could have been this wonky story about, look at this, food stamps are everywhere, but it's this incredible personalized, talking about individual, an elderly couple that's sort of on the verge of whether they're going to go on food stamps or not. So.
Well, that's really, that's a pretty classic documentary news technique. And although the documentary was still pretty strong in the 80s, that's kind of the beginning of the decline, at least on the networks, where you don't see that technique quite so much, and it goes over to the news magazine format. But I've also been interested, like since the 80s, of the focus on the individual. That almost culturally, there's, because of Reagan's economic policy and Reagan's approach in general to government working for me, that there's been more of examples of individual authorship. So even though Michael Moore is a left-wing filmmaker, he's very much in the Reagan-esque economic model because he's the entrepreneur.
Right.
So I just wondered if there's any historical
feature writing. So Breaking News actually it was that ghost ship fire. It had a reconstruction as part of its package that obviously used some of those devices. Well, C.J. Chivers did because he won for feature. There was one for local reporting about the treatment of the sexual abuse victims at Brigham Young. There's one particularly that I thought was Aaron Alberti was the writer. And then for Foreign, there's about Putin. And there was one about this growing body count of those who defy the Kremlin that I thought they all, it was just fascinating to read, to find them in all these places, especially Breaking News, you don't expect.
Right.
Yeah.
We still have some time. If there's other questions, can ask Ryan a question. Two questions. Well, two questions. One though, a quick sort of anecdote that confirms what you're talking about. In my, I teach in the Honors College. We had students read Bill McKibben's book Earth, and they hated it, like roundly hated it. Read Silent Spring, loved it. And the critique of Earth was that it was just they felt this barrage of facts, and they were overwhelmed. And with Rachel Carson, they really liked the narrative. How to respond to people though that would say, so like trying to find within scientific communities those people that say, well, but we need the facts, the hell with the narrative. We want it. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that's what the genre does, right? It's built on the fusion of the two. Right? So, I'll quote you at length because I use some of your writing in my classroom. The form of nonfiction writing that adheres to the reportorial truth-telling covenants, right? It's factual. It's indicative. These are the facts. But what the literary journalist does, what the traditional journalist does not do, is kind of render those facts and turn them into feeling, right? And we do that with narrative, with complicated plot structure, with immersion, with voice. To me, that's what brings me here in the first place, is this is really effective in the classroom. This stuff jumps off the page better than Cli-Fi. I can't throw my students nature articles. I can barely make sense of an abstract of a nature article. But this genre, it does it, and it does it so well, because I think it's that beautiful synthesis of the two. Go ahead.
Are there certain literary elements that are more, that you would associate more with climate change as opposed to, say, other social, political, cultural, ecological problems? So thinking, are the literary elements that you find are successful or useful for talking about climate change different than stories that are discussing poverty or systemic racism or any of these other sort of social topics?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that.
Okay.
I'm leaning towards the answer being no, but I haven't thought through it.
Mm-hmm.
So, Josh, I have a question for you. What would John Hersey do?
About what?
Writing about climate change.
Writing what? Oh Lord.
Not probably,
Yeah, I think I've probably said enough about John Hersey.
But that's not, so the scientific community is a piece published by Lewis and Maslow in Nature in 2014 called Defining the Anthropocene. And they're trying to figure out when this thing began, right? And so some on the outliers say it began with the agricultural revolution. Lewis and Maslow kind of fall into 1610, this point when the old world met the new and population declined. Others would argue that the Anthropocene began with the Industrial Revolution, but it seems like today the general consensus is the 40s, right? I mean, this piece itself might be something to kind of put into this conversation of feeling the facts, literary journalism amid the Anthropocene, both with the nuclear age, but also with the Great Acceleration. All these things happening at once. That's when they believe the Anthropocene began. Even though my paper, the title was maybe a bit misleading, but it was really focused in on climate change, which is a result of the Anthropocene. Yeah.
I wonder if you could make any use of now inclines, this changes everything, because it locates that also in the science, but also in the larger political, economic context that's given rise to that.
Yeah, I hate to say this, I haven't read it yet.
Because if you talk about the hyper object as something that is the effects of climate change, this sort of globally distributed layer of carbon or whatever, she goes all around the world. She talks to people all around the world. So you get a sense of a global phenomenon, I guess, as well as the context of globalization that's contributed to that acceleration.
So again, I'll follow up with an earlier claim I made in the paper. The genres are continuing to approach this question, right? I'm not arguing that they're not, that literary journalists aren't interested in this idea. Clearly they are. It continues to expand in frequency and scope. But what's lacking for me is the secondary materials making sense of this all. Historicizing the genre's approach to not merely environmental journalism, right? The earlier paper, I can't remember his name, but it was a fantastic paper. It was tracing back to Thoreau, like nature writing. Of course, I mean, people have been talking about this for hundreds of years. But come the late 80s, James Hansen and the questions concerning climate change itself, that's a pretty big deal. And the genre continues to address it. I'm just looking for more secondary research that's exploring and historicizing and contextualizing this new epoch that we're a part of.
Just throwing it out there, I'm just wondering if any scholarship on John McPhee is helpful to think about that. He's not exactly what I would call an eco-critic, but his work seems to do a lot of the same kind of, he does a lot of the same kind of work, doesn't he? I mean, he's talking about human impact on environment, and he does so much explaining, and he, holds with curiosity. I imagine those are the two things that students like yours, and maybe like Oliver's, have. They're either A, not curious, or B, defensive. And literary journalism is maybe uniquely capable of breaching both of those problems, telling a story that catches our interest and makes us feel less hostile to the controversial subject.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any last questions? Let's thank our panel.
bad, did it?